stimulus packages, which we were heavily criticized for not following. But our view was there was simply no point in pressing the accelerator when we ourselves had pressed on the brake. It would have used up a lot of fiscal and other resources and got very little output, as other countries also discovered. So instead, again, we did the barbell strategy. So what is the barbell strategy in this context? Well, first of all, rather than reinflate the economy, we opted for cushioning the system for the worst outcome for the most vulnerable sections. So this is the context in which we provided some money into the Jan Dhan accounts. This is the context in which we carried out the world's largest food program. 800 million people were provided with virtually free food up to all the way up to November. And even now, there are all kinds of support systems. Same thing was done for the business sector. The MSMEs were given 100% loan guarantees. Various financial deadlines were pushed back. The insolvency and bankruptcy court was held in abeyance because we didn't want cascades of defaults to come and jam up the IBC process. So what were we doing again? We were cushioning the system. Even we were not making the claim that we were reinflating the economy, because we weren't. You could not reinflate an economy where the supply side is jammed up. The problem was not a demand side problem only, which is what most other countries and many international experts were commenting on and advising us on. The problem was that we had constrained down the supply side. The supply side is simply not enough attention paid to it. We were holding it down, and there was no point in pushing against it anymore. Now, when we began to open things up from around about September, we saw immediately a lot of pent-up demand coming back. This is the context. This is the context, by the way, in which we also began to push, a series of medium-sized program packages were put in place to try and get demand going from the fiscal side. So people talk about Keynesian pumping. Yes, we did do it, but we timed it. So in October, you had capital expenditure by the government going up 129% year on year. November, it went up 249% year on year. December, 62% year on year. January numbers will be out. You will see they were substantially up. And we were doing various things. We're pumping out new projects, accelerating the ones that had been stuck. Many payments were made which had been stuck for some time for a variety of reasons. So again, you can see demand coming back into the system through a fiscal pumping. And of course, throughout the process, the Reserve Bank kept things easy so that, the whole system was lubricated, so to speak. So that is the context in which we have seen demand coming back. And I have to say that most of the short-term indicators suggest fairly strong revival in demand coming through, whether, you see power consumption or railway freight movement. Even car sales have come back quite a lot. In fact, there are now serious problems of delivery because some of the car companies are unable to keep up with demand. So, the waiting periods have actually gone up. So car sales will actually slow down, not because of demand, but because supply side can't keep up. So I keep coming back to the supply side point. So that brought us then to the budget. And we came to the conclusion that yes, the growth has come and there's still case for keeping this sort of push for demand up. So this is the reason, while we did take this massive 9.5% fiscal deficit in this financial year, which we had no choice about. The denominator shrank, revenues shrank, and we had all kinds of one-time extraordinary expenses. But going into next year, we decided we'll keep some momentum up on this. And so we have a fiscal deficit of 6.8% for next financial year. And we will slowly bring it down over a 3-year period back to where we were originally. This deviation is being done also with another sort of thing where we are different from other countries. Another sort of part of our strategy, which is that we have not done what many countries and many experts have been advocating, which is doing these grand stimulus packages based on, providing stimulus checks and so on to stoke consumption. Our view throughout was that when there is so much uncertainty, if you give these stimulus checks out, most of it will be saved. In fact, this is what happened even with the Jan-Dhan money that we gave for cushioning, despite the fact that you would think that at the bottom of the pyramid, at least they would have very high propensity to consume, that it turns out even there, they were willing to save the money. So these stimulus checks will not, in my view, be very, very successful in reviving. You won't get the second and third order impact. So we have decided to use this resource to, in fact, these fiscal resources to pump up infrastructure spending. Infrastructure here defined as widely as possible, which includes soft infrastructure like health, but also, of course, roads, bridges, and other things. Now, the idea here is the following. One, that of course we will run up debts for doing this, but we must leave behind some assets for future generations. So that is why we were very clear that we were going to build up debt against assets creation, something that I think is very, very important to keep in mind. Secondly, as I said, since we didn't think stimulus checks were going to be successful and we are spending ourselves, our view is and our experience is that
conference recording started.
Infrastructure spending is something that has many multiple feedback loops, and the feedback loops that you will get consequently will create jobs, it'll create demand for all kinds of activities, cement, steel, and so on. And very importantly, it will then in the end provide, while building the infrastructure, you get a demand, but in the end, it is also supply side because it creates capacity in the end in multiple ways. So that is how we thought about this. Now, finally, there was another very big difference between us and the approach of other countries, and that we also took a very strong supply side view of the whole matter. Clear. We don't think that we are going to enter the post-COVID world is simply a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. Our view throughout has been that, look, the post-COVID world will be quite different. It will have its own supply chains, its own geopolitics, its own technologies, it will have its own consumer behavior, and all of these factors will interact with each other in entirely unpredictable ways. So if this is the case, then we need to do supply side reforms in order to make factor markets flexible so that when whatever comes and hits us into the future, we will be able to navigate through it and adapt to it as an economy. So we decided to do a whole bunch of these factor market reforms. Dozens of central government labor laws were changed, and we have now replaced them with 4 labor codes, which are modern labor codes. And by the way, it's not the case that everything is in favor of employers. There are many things in the labor codes that favor employees. For example, we now have modern safety laws. We have modern working condition rules and so on. So, they are genuinely modern in a balanced way. So it's not like an imbalanced thing. We have done quite a lot of balancing act in those 4 and modernized those labor laws. We removed a lot of unnecessary regulations. Those of you who happen to be from the BPO and the IT services sector will know that in November, we removed all kinds of ridiculous, outdated telecom regulations from that sector. Those of you who work in that sector will know how important it is, because something like, I was told the manager was using up almost a third of his or her time managing all those regulations, which have now simply been scrapped. So same thing we did with the farm laws. These laws have been debated for 20, 30 years. And in the economic survey, we provided a long list of eminent thinkers who wrote about it in committees in the economic survey. Some of them now have, begun to grumble about its implementation, but all of them actually wrote that they should be implemented. And we stand by them. Okay, there may be some adjustments that may be needed to make them more smooth for certain segments of the farmers. But overall, we remain committed to implementing these farm laws in spirit, because they are good, particularly for small farmers, because they allow essentially a market to be created. After all, nobody will want their product to be sold through a mandi. After all, anybody here who produces cars or soaps or Coca-Cola, would you like to be your product to be only sold through a particular mandi? No. So why should the poor farmer be told that you can only go and sell in a particular authorized mandi? So we have freeing the system up. This does not mean that the existing mandis are going to disappear, though they will remain. But they now need to compete. And competition is the best way to introduce better services. If you want farmers to have proper supply chains, get proper middlemen to actually behave well with them and give them services, then you have to introduce competition. And this is the basic thought behind other reforms as well. So we are opening up all kinds of other sectors. You saw 74% now allowed into insurance. Well, if you want an insurance sector with good insurance products, you need an open system. We are doing that also with privatization. There will be some public sector presence in certain strategic sectors. We will maintain that for a variety of strategic reasons. But other things we are, as you can see, opening them up, and we will privatize many of the PSUs which no longer serve any strategic purpose. Now, we are not shy, by the way, of creating new PSUs where necessary, as will happen with the Development Finance Institution. But it doesn't mean that we are shy of using even the word privatization, which used to be an issue before. So this is our thinking process as we go into the future. Now, I know somebody will ask a question here about Atmanirbhar Bharat. So let me also clarify here that the fact of the matter is that Atmanirbhar Bharat is not a return to pre-1991 import substitution. We have no intention of going back and driving around in ambassadors ever again. We remain open. We intend to, as the Prime Minister and Finance Minister repeatedly said, we intend to be a part of the world economy. We intend to participate in global supply chains. We remain open to both foreign and private investments. And so, we remain a part of the world. This is not some sort of a retreat behind, gigantic tariff walls and sort of trying to encourage import substitution in the 1950s sense of the word. But this does not mean that we will not take national interest and economic resilience into account. We will be pragmatic about it, not ideological. And I will give you a couple of examples to explain what we mean by this. For example, we did not participate in RCEP. That is because we judged, for a variety of reasons, that this would not serve national interests. Now, this is not because we have some ideological problem with trade deals. If there is another trade deal that comes along, which works with us, we will happily participate in it. But it's a matter of judgment. Now, the same thing is true, for example, we discovered in the early stages of the pandemic last year, that while we may have this extremely competitive and large, pharmaceutical sector, many of the key ingredients that go into that pharmaceutical sector come from a certain single source that can easily break down on us. And in fact, it did. So if you have this sector, which is an important sector to us, is so heavily dependent on inputs from a single source abroad, which can suddenly shut down, then you will agree that providing some amount of support to creating at least some of those inputs and producing them in India is a good step towards resilience. This is about providing resilience to a globally competitive sector. It is not about protectionism. So it's about a pragmatic approach towards trying to create clusters in India, providing their resilience. The same approach is true of the PLI scheme. The PLI schemes is about creating certain amount of clusters in India for manufacturing, and even in services we can look at these so that certain activities get going. This is not a call for protectionism, and this is certainly not the case that once these clusters have been built, that they will have these protection forever. Once once they have been taught to run, must run on their own. So with that, let me stop, and I am happy to answer questions that you may have.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I think you preempted many questions, especially on your discourse on Atmanirbhar Bharat. And with the focus on infrastructure spending, privatization, asset monetization no longer a bad thing, long-term growth with public spending. These are some of the highlights you mentioned. I have got a series of requests for questions, so I will try to moderate them and maybe ask you to respond to each question, and then I'll take the next question. I'm going to invite Anil Padmanabhan to kick off the discussion. He's been a keen watcher of the North Block for several years, for centuries. So over to you, Anil.
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Sanjeev. Great opening address, and congratulations. I personally think it's a very seminal budget. So just sticking to your tenor of going behind the scenes and explaining the rationale, I just want you to take a little bit of a deep dive for us on the whole issue of disinvestment, and like you rightly say, it should be called privatization. And you have not shied away. You have not used that word, but you have not shied away from stating the intent. So can you tell me how the thinking on this worked in the North Block, in the final leg? Because you knew politically it is a hot potato and there's going to be massive pushback. You're seen with the farm laws, for example. And so what is the kind of thinking, and how did you make such a big call to take such a big move? Because if you remember, it was Yashwant Sinha way back in 1990 who coined the phrase disinvestment. And you have now completely redefined that word to privatization. It's a big, big move. So just on that, thank you.
Yes, I think a time must come in the history of a country where you have to call a spade and get on with it. And we have used the word, by the way, privatization. We have not shied away from it, and I think we need to. Very large amounts of resources are used up to keep alive companies like BSNL and Air India and so on. These are not trivial resources. And I know if the private sector can get on and use some of these resources and spaces to leverage them, why not? Because in the end, we will then get back, they become private. Not only will they be adding value rather than subtracting it, we can then, if they become profitable, we'll get taxes from them. And so, having healthy sectors where, we can open them up to the private sector to play is clearly something that we shouldn't be so apologetic about at all. And so this is the reason we went for it. Now, I am not in a position to answer for the political leadership because that's their prerogative, but I will say the economics of this has been well known for some time, as indeed has been the case for the farm laws. And many economists, including many who have written the economic surveys before me, have written about the need to do all of these measures. I think the political leadership is willing to use their political capital to do things that need to be done. I think that should be lauded. We economists can say whatever we wish. Ultimately, somebody has to take it through the political system, and the current political leadership clearly is willing to walk the talk. After all, many of those who are currently grumbling about it, and I'm not just talking about the politicians, but even the economists, they wrote glowing words about exactly the measures that we have implemented. So hopefully they will, hopefully this hypocrisy will now spread into opposing privatization as well.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Anil, I hope that answers your question. So I'm going to move on to, I have a request from the two ladies, Prema and Vinita. They both want to talk about the health sector. So maybe we can take these two questions together. So Vinita, you want to kick off, and then I'll invite Prema to supplement.
Sure. I'm going to begin again with complimenting the government to actually make reinvigorating human capital such an important pillar of this budget, and huge compliments for that, because even when I used to attend the World Economic Forum meetings where I'm a health industry officer, they always felt, and I'm going to use the word, health is the least glamorous of all the sectors, and the health minister is the least glamorous in that ranking. However, it's amazing also that we got almost 346% allocation, which includes the FC grants. But if you disaggregate the allocation to the healthcare sector, What has gone to MOHF, and I think we all know, is all just about, I think, 10.5% allocation. And if you include the FC grants to health, it's about 29.5%. So my question is like this, that, as we talk of resetting the world while its COVID pandemic is on and beyond, a lot of our non-communicable disease burden has gone up immensely. We are contributing hugely to premature death, mortality, disability. So drinking water and clean water and sanitation, which has got 300% allocation, is absolutely critical for preventive health. But then so are so many other things, incentivizing people to go for health checkups. So what could we expect? Do you think there is a possibility of more announcements for other social, economic, and maybe political determinants of health for us?
So, Prema, do you have, would you like to add any question to what Vinita said? Any supplement? You're mute, Prema.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead if you want to supplement the question.
Yeah, how can healthcare be delivered in other communicable and non-communicable diseases, especially to the poorest of the poor who are struggled in post-pandemic situation? We've been thinking about it and talking also, Ajay, about all of this. And so, Sanjeev, if you can let us know.
So let me be very clear about something. There is more than adequate evidence that in the last 200 years, most of the benefits that have come from health have actually not come from medicine, but from sanitation. This is something that there is more than adequate evidence on. So better drains, better toilets, better drinking water actually have much bigger and quicker multiplier effects on health outcomes, particularly for the poor, than do necessarily having more and more hospitals. That's not to suggest that hospitals are not needed. I'm just pointing out to you that the benefits from investing in sanitation, and by the way, this is something the state governments and municipal authorities also need to take seriously, because much of that provision happens at that level of government, not at the central government level. But nevertheless, we should be absolutely clear. Our cities need to be cleaned up. Our villages need to be cleaned up. We need proper garbage thing. Drains have to be unclogged. All of these sanitation type issues ultimately have huge benefits on health outcomes. So that is the reason we have focused on this. This is not to suggest that your medical part of the package has not gone up dramatically, and we will. But at the stage of development where we are, we need to clean up our act on sanitation first. Swachh Bharat is as much about health as it is about generally cleaning up aesthetically. It's ultimately about health. So that is the reason we have focused on sanitation. But yes, health allocation has also gone up significantly, and we will ramp it up as it goes. But do not underestimate the importance of the sanitation and water supply being critical to health, because that's where communicable diseases spread. But even non-communicable diseases very often are related to poor sanitation.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I'm going to now invite Virat from Apple, and I also want to thank Apple for their support in organizing this meeting. Virat, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Sanjeev. Good to see you again. I had one question around the task that the government has ahead of itself, which comes out of the budget, and one around the philosophy, also because you're the author of the fantastic economic survey. Second year in a row, if I might say. We really like the last one. And then this one has some very good insights as well, and frank declarations. If you look at the grand plan, this is the classical role of the government. You agreed to sort of get out of stuff that we shouldn't be doing. You're sort of collecting money from all of that, private investment, tough job to do, and then invest it. And you and both the Secretary have been quite candid about the fact that between handouts and capex, we're going to go with capital expenditure. And if done well, as you stated, it has externalities and serious upside to the overall impact that has. Otherwise, you could be getting handouts and just not spending, conservative behavior. So that's a fantastic philosophy. Nobody can argue with that. We've been waiting for years for the government to do that. But what it also does is places unparalleled pressure on the government for implementation, right? Because you have to collect the money and you have to spend the money, you build the infrastructure. And so all of this shifts this pressure of implementation, which, as you know, we have a, let's say, a mixed record at best, if I'm being polite, to do this. How confident and what are the specific steps that you think will be taken to do both of these, collect the money and spend the money, because both of these are in your backyard? That's one on the question. The second one that I had was more on the philosophy of what you're saying, and I'll link it to the survey as well. You've talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat. We want GVCs. We want expansion. And I know that you and the chief economic advisor, last year we were sitting at the Oberoi when we had this open forum. You said we dislike duties on inputs, especially meant for exports. That's completely wrong. We shouldn't be doing this stuff. But again, we see some of that comes through, sometimes against the request of the industry and even the nodal ministry. And then that goes to what you have said in the economic survey, which is we over-regulate because we want to control every single outcome, and eventually nobody can do that. Fantastic, little documentation. On this one, how do we move from budget being an absolute surprise for everybody, taking the example of duties, when you're actually looking to increase exports and competitiveness, and move to a more, not just consultative, but also inclusive process where actual views are taken in the broader view of building exports from India and competitiveness? So two different questions, but I thought I'll just ask them in one go. Thank you.
Sanjeev, if I could request you to take one more question, which is a supplement from Harish.
He'll forget them. You can't give him three.
No, Harish's question is similar to what you have. Harish, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Ajay. Sanjeev, again, congratulations on the budget. I think the best testimony is that in many of the meetings that we've had with the industry association, people have run out of questions in the first half an hour, I think. I think my question is on economic survey, and this is a follow-up to Virat. There's one great chapter that you've written, and again, congratulations on the economic survey, and clearly sees the professional author writing it, because it's almost like unputdownable. We kind of read it, and pretty much at a stretch. On the 6th chapter on process reforms, you've talked about, extensively on what needs to be done. And you talked about, going away from mechanical regulation to a bit more being discretionary thing. So my one question is a bit philosophical question. We always liked the economic survey. It seems to be like always forward looking and, always says a lot of things that needs to be done. So I just want, the philosophical question is, how did the economic survey and the budget kind of play out? And then also in the broad policy making of the government, how is the economic survey used, right? That is one. And secondly, onto the question of mechanical regulation versus discretionary regulation. Again, like the way you mentioned, Atmanirbhar Bharat is not about, self-isolation, but to be part of the global supply chains. And I think in our industry, in telecom, for example, it's impossible to manufacture every product we sell in India. So we've been talking about a situation where we manufacture a few products at global scale and export. And in lieu of that, give us some credits for what we might not be able to manufacture in India, but we still want to supply to the government. So we'd like to have some conversation with you to kind of, I can provide you much more details on a one-on-one, to have some of these pragmatic, policies to play. Thank you.
So first, let me say about implementation. Obviously, implementation is key to doing any of these things, but this is even true for non-capital spending as well. In fact, if anything, it's easier to keep track of capital spending because, you can at least see what is the final outcome. If it's a bridge or whatever it is, you can go and touch it. So ironically, revenue expenditure is much leakier because it disappears into things that you can never go and check on ever again because it doesn't create any final outcome. So in that sense, ironically, this approach has higher chance of being implemented because we can monitor it. And as it happens to be, a lot of effort has been done into identifying some 50 odd major infrastructure projects that are being monitored literally on a daily basis. And we are keeping track of them. Regular meetings are held at the highest level to keep track of how these things are done. And so those are, the very large airport projects, for example, and some of the highway projects and so on. And they are being really watched carefully. If there are, files stuck somewhere. And very often what happens is that, a major project gets stuck because of a very minor some signature required at some level. So that kind of slowdown is being watched very carefully. And again, a dashboard has been created, and we keep good track of this. As this top 50 is kept track of, we'll add more and more till we'll expand that list. And many of them are there in the national infrastructure pipeline. So many of them are taken from there to keep track of. So I would argue that I think we have become better at implementing these things than people give us credit for. But one of the issues, of course, was payments. And that I think has been smoothened substantially. You can ask those who are involved in those sectors whether payments have become much smoother in the last couple of years or not. Now, about the philosophical point about, and those who have not read the chapter 6 of the Economics Survey Volume 1, what they're referring to is the following pitch that is made there, which is that there is a fundamental problem in the way we think of regulations in India. And this is that we think that good regulation is one that has worked out every possible outcome in the future. And then a good regulation is one that has then written down what we should do in the case that this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. Now, this unfortunately is not a very sensible thing to do. It's in fact a very Soviet way of thinking about it. And we tend to do this with everything, by the way. This is not just about regulations. This is about how we design cities also. For some reason, Chandigarh is thought of being as being the ideal city. But in fact, Chandigarh is nothing much more than a retirement home for civil servants. And why? Because they have again created a master plan and worked out exactly how every little bit of that city is going to function. So Chandigarh has never consequently produced anything of economic or cultural value. To the extent it shows some verve, it comes in Mohali, which is outside of the plan. Meanwhile, Gurgaon, with no planning, has done better. So the point I'm making to you is that it is better to take regulations and set them up in such a way that we are not trying to work out every possible outcome, but basically make them simple and allow for a significant amount of discretion to be allowed to whoever is the decision maker. Now, whenever I say this, oh my God, discretion will be allowed, this is a bad thing. Actually, no. If you make more complicated regulations, that ironically, as we show in that chapter, leads to greater regulation, greater discretion. So more regulation leads to greater discretion, not less. So it's much better to have simple regulation, which gives a few degrees of discretion, and things remain transparent because you can see exactly what is being done. And then rather than invest in ever more regulation, you invest into transparency. So that is basically the point being made. Now, this is a philosophical point, which ironically probably needs to be taught right at the beginning, starting with Masuri, because then this line of thought will get hardwired, because, otherwise the default is to overregulate. And you can try and change any one regulation to try and solve one problem. You add 3 more. So this is like Rakta Bija. So if the only way to stop it is to change the default setting of the way we think about these issues, and that is the reason of that chapter. We illustrate it obviously with a few cases. The good illustration which we have given, there is an illustration of a bad situation and a good situation. The bad situation illustration is the illustration of how to shut down a company in India, even when there is no cases or disputes. It takes 1,570 days to shut down a company voluntarily if there is no dispute at all. That is 4.5 years. In Singapore, you can do it in 6 to 12 months. In the UK, you can do it in 15 months. And if there happens to be a dispute, then, then the cases can go on for a lifetime. So this cannot be the basis of, and it's all done because, in order to clarify, there may be a PF case, there may be some income tax. So there has to be a smooth system of just going and working out how much is the income tax requirements or whatever it is, maximum 15 months, maybe 2 years at most. And then the company should be able to be shut down. If we want companies to be set up, we need a system of shutting them down as well. Now, I'll give you the opposite side, how good systems can also be created. One of the major problems in the government, everybody talks about tendering of the very big projects, but a large part of in terms of the number of purchases, they are actually mostly trivial things, buying chairs, tables, pens, laptops, things like that. Most in terms of number of purchases, that is how most of the transactions are that kind of transactions. And typically there used to be all kinds of issues relating to making these petty purchases. What has now happened is that all of this has been put into the GEMS portal. And it is completely transparent. Any of you who are watching can go into the GEMS portal and look at the prices at which things are being purchased. Now, immediately what has happened as a result of that, the gap between purchase price of, say, a laptop and what you can buy it off Amazon has gone down. Now, they're not always exactly comparable, but once you have made the adjustments, they are now within some ballpark of what the free market purchase price of that item is, which was not the case till the GEMS portal came on. There used to be a massive gap. Now, the other thing that happens is that now having created this transparent portal, we now have given full discretion to the decision maker to buy. As long as they buy it off the GEMS portal, they can buy whatever they want without too much hassle. So the honest decision maker makes it much easier. They go on to GEMS portal. As long as it is on the GEMS portal, they can purchase it. So many people are going onto the GEMS portal and purchasing whatever it is. I want to buy a laptop, you buy it. He doesn't have to now get 3 courts, do all kinds of complicated things to prove that he's not being, somehow being corrupt. So the GEMS portal is a very good example of how a transparent system has dramatically reduced rent seeking, has made life easier for the honest decision maker, and is completely transparent, since any citizen who wants to go there and check out a particular item can keep track of it. And this is the best form of democracy, that every citizen can keep track of what is being purchased at what price.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I have a number of questions. So what I'll do is, if I'll request Raman to ask the next question, then Ishtiaq to be brief, and then I have a couple of questions. So Raman, over to you.
We are running out of time, be aware.
I know. That's what I'm saying. Brief questions, yeah.
Thank you. Sanjeev, you normally like speaking, not speaking, but an interactive session, but you did speak, and wonderful. My congratulations added to everyone else's. If I can use 2 of the 3 words used by the second apparition, if I remember correctly from Macbeth, and those were bold and resolute. It says a lot about the budget. Anil called it seminal, that will have an influence on future developments. Yes, let's hope so. But I do worry about the resources that you say that you should raise to finance, and resources from the proposed privatization, if not disinvestment. It's a rather large amount. Why I worry is, Sanjeev, is because of the track record so far over many years. Some of the things that they have been done is pulling back issues once announced. That does a lot of damage to valuation of those companies. And that is something which some of the others doesn't seem to be understood, I hope. And that's why I wanted to use the word resolute. Going ahead, it is actually used in that sense, because it's a huge amount that you are depending on.
So let me respond to that very quickly. Look, the proof of the pudding is only in the eating. So nothing I'm going to say is going to prove anything. So let some time pass, and when I do my next PAFI talk, since I seem to do quite a few, hopefully we will have convinced you that we are serious about it. Because literally nothing I say now will prove anything. So only when we do it will you be convinced. So just wait for a little time.
Okay.
That's a good promise to move on. Ishtiaq, over to you for the next question.
Thank you, Ajay. And I'm conscious of time, Sanjeev. So just a quick one. I mean, this is specific to my sector, which is the food processing industry. And in the economic survey, you did mention that, it's probably, it's growing, last 5 years grown around 10% as against 3.1% of agriculture growth or about 8% of manufacturing. This is probably not the best question to ask the economic advisor to the government, but oftentimes we do try and wash the sin or mistakes, probably is a better word, of our predecessor. So 2015, in a pre-GST scenario, when the committee headed by your predecessor actually put the beverages sector, large part of it, which you mentioned also in your talk, Coca-Cola and the carbonated drinks, in the sin category, right? Which is very, very unique to India. I mean, there are places across the world where it is, taxed at a higher level, but the differential between this and rest of the food processing is almost 22%. I think it'll be a good idea, the way the entire beverage and food sectors are engaged from farm to the last mile of the smallest retail, to really look at it. You've talked about it in the past that you don't want to talk about GST, but since it is something which is created by the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor, I thought I'll just place it for you.
Well, actually, ironically, we in the central government don't control the GST. It's largely controlled by the states. We have a vote there, but the bulk of the votes come from the states, and we go with whatever is there. This GST is something that we don't really control. I mean, if you want, we can have a look at it. But generally speaking, we do not really push for specific changes. We are more into looking at the system as a whole, and that is where we are at. And I am all in favor of overall simplification over time. But as things stand, we would probably not want to tinker with it for the time being. We introduced it. We knew that as with every country that has introduced GST, there would be some turmoil. And there was, because it is a completely new system. But now I think it has settled down to a point where it functions reasonably well. Almost everybody I talk to, including former critics, say that, look, it works now reasonably smoothly. And very importantly, it is a dramatic improvement on whatever used to exist before. And it was a much, much smoother, cleaner system. So I think my preference would be to let it settle for a little while. But in the end, I would prefer a simpler system. Whether that will benefit the particular category you're looking at, well, I can't comment on that.
So thank you so much. I'm going to slip in two quick questions which I got from the participants. One is that, do you see synergy between the state government budgets with the central government budget? Because now you'll see a series of state government budgets coming up. And second is a question again from Anil, is the war chest you created with DEA, is there any logic and how it will be used?
Well, it is a bit of a danger for the principal economic advisor of the central government to comment on state governments. It's their prerogative and they should do what they're doing. I can only hope that it is aligned well with what we are trying to do overall. And I think you will find that is the case. But too dangerous for us to comment on them. And as far as war chest, I'm not quite sure what you mean. But if what you mean is that our big effort that we are going to put into going out there and spending on infrastructure, yes, we are serious about that.
Anil, you want to ask that question?
I was referring to the 40,000 crore the FMS allocated to the DEA. So I'm not sure whether such a sum has been allocated in the past, and she said it will be used if in case there's a last mile issue. That is what I was referring to.
So I'm not entirely sure about which specific bits. It's not like I carry the whole budget in my head. But if you're saying that if there are certain sectors which are kind of almost reached there, haven't, there is a large project which has not been finished because of some last mile issues, then I suppose that will be spent. But I'll be careful not to respond too clearly on this because I'm not sure which exact bit you're referring to.
Fair enough. I think I'm mindful of the time. So Shubho, over to you. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you.
Shubho, you're mute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal. I just got 1 minute to deliver a vote of thanks, and I'll do it within that time. We at PAFI deeply appreciate two qualities in you. You actually appreciate explaining and engaging with people. And I suspect that comes out of your deep knowledge of Indian history and culture, which probably, in my view, makes you a better practitioner of economics than many others we have seen before.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that engagement today, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sanjeev, thank you so much. And we'll let you go on the promise that you'll come back to PAFI again. And I also once again want to thank Virat and Apple for their support for this program. Sanjeev, all the very best and keep the flag flying.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye.